aspect of import-export of typically gooey duck, king crab, and just recently, within the last couple of years, our Washington Animal Trafficking Act. Just in case I slip up and say something wrong here at the end, so I am an enrolled tribal member in the state of Washington, so I have a kind of a unique perspective on some of our challenges that we face. I also served as a tribal police officer for a while before I took my job as a fish and wildlife officer. Also, concurrently, I have a little bit of world travel experience courtesy of the United States Army. So I'm a CID special agent. I kind of travel around during deployed environments. I do basically felony level investigations. So kind of hard to say, but on some level in the military, we do quite a few sex assaults, suicides, stuff along those lines. So we get quite a exposure to different types of crime. As another thing that I wind up doing is protective services here for Department of Defense dignitaries. So I get to do a lot of travel across the globe for stuff like that. And to a lesser extent, but probably my most recent trip to Afghanistan, I did what if anyone has heard of sensitive site exploitation. So it basically is a 60-second to a 10-minute window to run into a kind of a hot scene and grab some evidence as quickly as possible, make sure I maintain chain of custody, and it gets entered into the legal system for whatever host nation we happen to be with, so to help in their prosecution. So kind of a weird mix of things when it comes to what a fish and wildlife guy is doing standing up here in front of you today. So here's the big slide. So I highlighted this one in red for myself, and I just want to be really clear. When I present this material, it really is from a field perspective. So I'm not a manager in any way, shape, or form. I am not a supervisor. I don't have anything to do with the business operations of my law enforcement agency. So it really is a boots on the ground, in the trenches kind of perspective. You know, some of the frustrations that I see, some of the successes, and kind of how we do business as it relates to international wildlife trafficking. And like I said, I'll cover this here in just a little bit, but we have, as a state agency, have only been doing wildlife, animal trafficking really on an international scale for the last 2 years as it relates to species here indigenous to Africa. So not so much in the way of pangolin, but we do a ton of elephant stuff, mostly in the form of worked pieces, so the net skis and the carvings, and probably to a lesser extent some of those products that go with it. That's kind of our bigger ones. So what my plan is just to kind of touch on these, just to give you an idea as to how our law enforcement, as far as natural resources goes in the U.S., if you're not familiar with it already. Probably many of you have potentially dealt with some of these agencies already. Anyone have any experience with U.S. Fish and Wildlife or NOAA? Have had a chance to run across any of those folks? Okay. So I'll go over those. Then I'll kind of talk about just my state in general, kind of how we got to the place where we are dealing in elephant ivory for the most part, and then kind of talk about specifics as it relates to our ivory work. So probably the first agency, there are many federal agencies in the U.S. that have kind of an interest in wildlife trafficking. And as we've heard, as you guys already know, very seldom is a poacher just a poacher. They're involved in so many other things. And so whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking, usually they're in the middle of it a lot. So we have a lot of agencies that are interested in kind of poaching activity. But really, U.S. Fish and Wildlife is one of two whose main focus is to focus on the natural resources aspect of law enforcement. And they are, as it says, kind of a Department of Interior agency. And they really focus, as it relates to the Endangered Species Act, CITES, the IUCN list, and some Marine Mammal Protection Act stuff. And really, they're just looking at walrus. But they come into play. U.S. Fish and Wildlife comes into play for us when we're looking at interstate trafficking of elephant products, and to some extent rhino. like many of us, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, our agencies are strapped. I would imagine everyone's probably in the same boat. Anyone have an excess number of officers for their agencies, or is everyone running short-handed with too much work? Anyone have too many officers? Okay. So these guys, so on the west coast of the U.S., there are only 4 special agents that actually work in Fish and Wildlife. And so not very much. It's a pretty big area for 4 folks to work. So their other federal counterpart is NOAA. That's its Office of Law Enforcement. They deal with the same thing with the Endangered Species Act, but they're mainly focused on fish and shellfish, and to some extent the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It's like mostly like killer whales, gray whales, that type of stuff, and seals, sea lions. Again, that's another agency that's strapped. They have about 3 or 4 folks that work in 3 states on the West Coast, and they have a brand new program because they're so in need of agents. They've gone out and they've hired a bunch of uniformed officers to kind of fill that bill. And they've got 4 or 5 brand new ones that they're just training up. But again, they don't have anywhere near enough bodies to take care of the business they need to take care of. So really, looking at just those 2 agencies, NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, what they've done kind of on a national scale for us is they've gotten about 30 of the 50 states to actually try to enact some form of legislation. And that many of those states have failed, their measures have not successfully passed. But there are roughly 9 of those 30-some states that actually have some form of legislation in place. The problem, you see it by the last bullet, it says lack of uniformity. So all of the states, even though they have some measures enacted, are different. So for instance, in the state of California, every piece of proboscidean, or every proboscidean species is illegal to sell in California. So for instance, in California, you can't sell mastodon, you can't sell mammoth, and you can't sell elephant. In Washington State, we still make it legal to sell mastodon and mammoth, but it's just the elephant that is illegal for us. So it becomes a bit of a problem, as we'll see a little bit later. And if I can ask, so I mean, I truly don't know how you guys deal with it generally. Is it an assumption, or do you guys just have enough experience to know, like let's say take a worked piece for instance. How do you guys know that it's not mastodon or mammoth? Anyone just give me a ballpark? How do you guys make that determination in the field? Anyone think of a seizure? Is it all mostly in raw form, like raw tusks? Yeah, so are most of the seizures like in the form of a raw tusk, or do seizures come in like carved forms, like net skis or those types of things? Almost all raw. Okay. And that's what I was kind of thinking. I hadn't asked that question before, but I was kind of curious because for us, we see almost no raw product. Everything is carved, the hand-carved stuff. And so it's a little more problematic for us. So as far as my agency goes, so Washington State Fish and Wildlife is largely a biological conservation agency. And they're concerned with habitat, with fish, shellfish, and wildlife. And they're concerned about, mostly focused on kind of just, the perpetuation of those species within the state. And it kind of contrasts with what I do, or what my enforcement folks do. We have roughly 125, I think, altogether across the state, 125 officers or detectives that are a very small portion of Washington Fish and Wildlife as enforcement. But our concern, or our main focus, is really not the conservation of the species, and a lot of people were shocked by this. Our job really is to make sure there's an equitable chance for people to harvest those animal species. So we're not concerned about kind of the smaller stuff. We're looking at kind of making sure everyone plays fair when it comes to taking big game, small game, fish, and shellfish. So just a little bit about the state of Washington. So as you see in the U.S., it's in that upper north, or the upper left corner, the Pacific Northwest. And some of the big stuff that happens out there as far as the big business is, obviously Boeing is out there. So the aeronautic industry is pretty huge. A lot of tech companies, you know, your Microsofts, Amazons, stuff like that are out there. And agriculture is huge for us. With let's say apples and potatoes probably are the biggest products that are coming in and out of our state. And really, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at all the seaports across the country, there are two cities, Seattle and Tacoma, that are relatively close together, and they're responsible. They're probably the fourth largest export-importer ports in all the country, and the bulk of it is airline stuff. But there is a large portion of fish, shellfish, and wildlife that leave the state through those two ports. Really, when I sit and when I get to hear your all experience, sounds like we're working with the raw tusks. Like I said, we don't see many raw tusks. We do lots of inspections at these seaports. We don't ever see container ships or cargo containers full of tusks. What we do see are thousands and thousands of pieces of the carved net skis and other carvings. So really, we're almost like a secondary destination. We're not kind of the final destination for a lot of this ivory, but a lot of it does pass through Seattle and Tacoma for us. All right, bonus points. Anyone have an idea what that is? Anyone? It's a deer family. Next size up. So that's one of our elk. So kind of the same deal, probably the size of a horse. Pretty decent size on those things. So just some of the natural resources that we have. If you look, so I said about 125 officers across the state. The bulk of those folks are tied up in regulations as it relates to wildlife in that upper right corner. So a lot of hunting of birds, small game, and big game. So the cougars, all the bear, all the elk, all the deer, moose, stuff like that. About another third of the agency is dedicated to that fish and shellfish on the recreational side and the commercial side. On occasion, we do some migratory birds. That's more of the federal guys' nexus, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or our U.S. Fish and Wildlife counterparts. Same with the gray whales and the killer whales. We go out there and do patrols, make sure that folks are staying away from those things. But where we start to get into the trafficking piece is we see a lot of the timber and exotic woods leaving the state of Washington. And quite honestly, there are not many folks that know much about that for us. And so I know we miss a lot at the port. King crab is another thing that's changed recently, and all of our animal trafficking stuff. So I'll cover that here in a couple slides, but that's where we start getting into the So some other stuff that is kind of challenging for us when it comes to enforcing anything, whether it's animal trafficking or just regular wildlife stuff. We have, I guess you could term it we like to call it a progressive culture, and really what that means, from where I sit as a law enforcement guy, is a lot of times our criminals seem to have way more rights than the police officers or the regular citizen. And so they get off. I mean, I hear a lot of similarities, kind of before you guys changed and had the amendment changed. But we had a lot of folks that commit some pretty serious natural resource violations, and they wind up getting a $100 fine, a slap on the wrist, and they walk away, and nothing happens to them. They don't get any jail time. They don't get any significant penalty for what they've done. So that's still, that's still pretty much the state for us. We further complicate matters because we have 18 sovereign Indian tribes within the state of Washington. So we have our own little state, and we've got 18 countries inside of our state. And there was federal law back in the 70s that kind of changed everything. So while those Indian tribes collectively represent less than 1% of our population, they are entitled to 50% of all the harvestable fish and shellfish in the state of Washington. So imagine if I would ask you to enforce a law somewhere, but I tell you, but you can't have access to anyone's records, and half of that product is leaving through another entity that lives right next door to you, or lives right, literally next door to you. We don't have any oversight. We don't have any, sight on that. We're supposed to be co-managers, but it's pretty tough because they're a sovereign nation, so it makes our job all the tougher. They don't have to really give us any information. So kind of a complex landscape trying to figure out how to navigate that and actually make any pretty decent arrests. So here are the species that mostly we're talking about when we talk about international trafficking for us. So prior to the last 2 years, I worked almost exclusively gooey duck. And anyone have any idea? You ever seen those before? So in that bottom left picture, a gooey duck is a massive clam, anywhere from 2 to 6 pounds. And it's a high dollar item, and as you might imagine, it's harvested in the state of Washington, a couple other places on the West Coast, but it goes directly to China on nonstop flights. China, to a lesser extent, Japan. So that's a Washington domestic product that we regulate, that we watch, but mostly in an export capacity. Sturgeon is another one. Hopefully, I think when Sean Carnes gets here, he's our Tennessee, the Tennessee presenter. Hopefully he'll tell you guys a good story about sturgeon and paddlefish. But again, for us, that's kind of an international commodity, mostly export. And that is kind of for us, a Russian organized crime, or I guess an Eastern European organized crime kind of a industry that we're watching, that we keep tabs on. King crab is another one for us. That's a recent one, kind of like our Washington animal trafficking. Just within the last 2 years, we've started monitoring that. There are no commercial quantities of king crab in Washington state, but we have now added those to our state law so we can get into businesses that deal in them, because there's so much illegal stuff being trafficked from the Russian Far East that we had to add them to our state law as a state species so we could start regulating them. So the worked ivory, that's stuff we see routinely coming through Seattle, the Seattle area, and the exotic woods. And one of the interesting things for us is back in the day before the big bans, like the 76 bands of ivory and 1976 bands. So the Pacific Northwest used to be a hotbed for carvers because it was kind of centrally located. It was on a direct route to the Asian markets in China and Japan. It had a lot of product coming down from Alaska, the Alaska natives, to carve. So we used to have a ton of carvers in the Seattle area, the Portland, Oregon area, and the Vancouver, BC area. So when the ban came, all of those carvers left and took the ivory with them, all the tusks, all the raw product. But what is left in my area are all those pieces that were worked. So there's quite a bit of stuff for us to do there. So today where we see these is mostly in the marketplaces. So this is just a shop downtown Seattle. So even though it is technically now against the law, these shops are still all over the place. And there are so many that we can't we're not very effective because, and I'll show you our resources here in a minute, but there are so many there. You have to have a skill set to be able to identify a carved piece of ivory in the field. And a lot of our guys we're doing so many different things, a lot of our guys don't have time to do this. And so we're working at them as fast as we can, but in 2 years we haven't caught up. A lot of antique shops, estate sales, and eBay, OfferUp, Craigslist, those things are killing us. You can go on there any day and you could pull up 10 or 15 sales that are within 5 miles of your house. And so trying to pick out which ones are doing big quantities of things as opposed to the mom and pops who's selling one item, kind of challenging as well. But that stuff is, there's so much out there, it becomes a problem for us. So here is kind of Washington's response. And I'll get into the NGO piece of it here just briefly. But this went through, they tried it a couple times, but they finally adopted what we had Public Initiative Initiative 1401, and it went through the 5th of December in 2015, where it made it illegal to, in essence, do anything. You can't sell it, you can't hand it to your friend, you can't give it to your child. They defined a bunch of covered animal species for us, and they pretty much said you can't do anything with it. So how we defined it in our law, it's somewhat similar to how, to the definitions I just saw on the amendment. But really, prohibition of the sale, purchase, trade, and distribution of the parts of covered animal species. Well, that we're going as far as saying now distribution is me handing it to my child. Here, I no longer want this piece of elephant ivory, I'm going to give it to you. That's now a gross misdemeanor under Washington state law. So it makes it pretty tough. And we have defined these covered animal species basically by just piggybacking on the CITES and the IUCN Red List. But really what my job is now is, for the last 2 years, has been focusing on the elephant ivory stuff. Anyone have any experience with ivory ID, like determining the difference between extant or live elephant and mammoth or mastodon? Anyone been to those trainings? Okay. So that turns out to be a huge issue for us, because as we'll see, in the field, you can't really make that determination. So it's just not possible with the way things currently are set up. So I talked about our state's resources. So here we go. Literally, here's where we are. There's me. I have gone to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's forensic ID for ivory. So I go there. In theory, I should be able to look at a piece of ivory and tell you whether it came from a walrus or an elephant or a warthog or whatever. So I'm the state's only ivory technician. My partner, Detective Lauren Wendt, so she just started the canine program for us. And it's up and running right now, and her partner is named Benny. And right now he is certified in detecting bear gall, elephant ivory specifically. He can distinguish between walrus and elephant and all of those types of things, and he can pick out the elephant ivory. He does firearms and he does shark fins, because those are kind of our big four right now. Anyone associated with a dog program here? I heard some talk about people starting them. Anyone's agency have a dog canine program for ivory? No. In Zambia? Okay.
They are trading the dogs from Kenya. They're becoming Malawi recently.
Nothing yet in Malawi, but
No, we don't have dogs.
okay.
We're having the dogs for drugs.
Oh,
Yeah, but for ivory, we are in the pipeline.
okay. Yes, ma'am.
In Zambia, we've got 4 units that are specifically trained for wildlife monitoring. different areas, including some that go to the airport and carry out random roadblocks. And most of them are trained in ivory, firearms, bushmeat.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like it's a new program for us, so we're just kind of learning it as well, kind of as we go. So she's working kind of closely with California Fish and Game. They've got kind of a head start. They've got 4 or 5 dogs as well. So we're kind of piggybacking on the work they've already done, trying to catch up. So I said this law for us has been in effect for about 2 years. Probably the first year and a half, really, they wanted us to focus on public outreach for a variety of reasons. They wanted to educate the public because it was a drastic change. Those pieces of ivory that you used to have that were okay suddenly became illegal overnight for you to do anything with. And so they wanted to give the public as much notice as possible. So they told us for about a year and a half, don't arrest people, just go educate them. So we also went out, we hired a public affairs officer to kind of push our message out there on all sorts of social media platforms, and did a bunch of intentional interviews with local media, kind of trying to get the dog's face, Benny out there and Lauren out there to show what they were doing. Turns out what's probably been the most effective for us is partnering with all of our zoos, because they're massive proponents of having our displays out there and kind of running displays for our dog. So they showcase the canine's ability to detect ivory. And we also have a big trailer that we drag around to all sorts of events, like recruiting events and kind of public shows, where we have all of the items that we've seized from people. So we drag it around on display, kind of as a show and tell for all the illegal stuff that's happened. So here's just kind of a snapshot since we started in 2016 about what we're looking at every year. And so again, it's just really about 2 of us. So we had about 200 cases that we had to deal with. They're just for ivory in the state of Washington that we dealt with just with education. 2017, same thing. We're over 200. And it is the first time, at the end of 2017, it is the first time we've ever tried to prosecute one of these. So it's in the middle of its prosecution phase right now. And already in 2018, we're already over 100. And folks, because we have started educating them and because we're starting to arrest people, it's becoming increasingly difficult for us now because people know how we do business, because the media in Washington State really pushes all of your investigative methodologies out there. So it makes it a little tough. So I have a whole laundry list of kind of challenges, the things that make it difficult, but I'm going to kind of, you guys have covered many of those, and a lot of them I'll bring up afterwards in other people's presentations. But I just want to say there are some out there, and I'll kind of skip over that portion of it and kind of get into some of the stuff that maybe you all can use or have access to, and that's just the stuff that we use as investigative tools. So this is really it. So ours is a little bit different. So because we're not working with raw ivory, and all the pieces that we're working with are all worked pieces, all been carved and polished and stained to kind of potentially conceal the true identity. We really have a tough time trying to figure out in the field what something's origin is. And really it does boil this down to this. Our uniform guys, when they get trained on ivory identification, or someone like myself goes out, you really have about 60 seconds, 1 to 3 minutes to figure out what something is before you need to move on to the next thing. And the problem with it is it can't be done in the field, like I've said, just by the naked eye or your regular testing. So I have to carry like an ultraviolet flashlight or a light. I have to have a magnifying glass. And even then, I can't tell. And so short of DNA, it's not possible for me. Because the only way I can get DNA is all destructive testing right now, right? So I have to, if I took a piece of ivory from you to test it for DNA, I have to destroy a portion of it. And what if I'm wrong? Then I get sued and all sorts of stuff. So I can't take it from you to determine. So I really could never make an arrest. So it's really problematic for us, our field identification. So, there it is again. So that, for us, that mastodon looks exactly like elephant in the field, for the most part. Mammoth is different. I can tell mammoth. I can't tell mastodon from elephant. Well, again, just in Washington, mastodon is legal. Mammoth is not legal. Okay, that's another NGO that this is a big thing for them. The ivory trade. So they're actually working. Their research teams are working on portable X-ray devices for us to be able to take like a radar gun to scan a hard, dense item, and it will read out on the scan elephant ivory or rhinoceros horn or whatever the case might be. They've supposedly tested it in Indonesia, but we have not. They have not been able to reproduce the results. So we're kind of waiting on them to fix that. But that is an option. Anyone come across these things at all before in any line of work? The SIO devices. So if you were to Google SIO, it's a pretty unique little system. It's a handheld scanner about the size of an old school pager. And you can walk up to a piece of fruit in the grocery store and it will tell you if that piece of fruit is ripe, what its sugar content is. It uses infrared technology and it tells you a bunch of the dietary information about that. So you can actually do that or use that technology in conjunction with just about any material. They're set up so you can put it on a piece of wood, and if you do enough samples of wood, it will tell you what kind it is. So again, getting back to the stuff, so none of those non-invasive techniques have yet worked for us consistently, so I can't use them. So I'm still out of luck when I'm looking at a piece of ivory in the field. So we have to go the invasive route. We have to start destroying stuff. So they are also coming up with a DNA assay device for us. It doesn't work with ivory because it's a soft tissue thing. It's for like fish or game meat or bush meat, some of that kind of stuff. You could actually put a sample in it, and within 15 minutes, it would tell you specifically what species of animal that came from. So it's a pretty sharp technology, but it doesn't help me with ivory. But again, this is the NGO that's helping me with developing technology to be able to test for ivory in the field. So the other that you say for sure this is elephant. Do you guys ever come across that? Maybe?
Yeah, but the DNA is not common. Having the DNA test would like
They don't make you go that far on the prosecution side?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
There was a certain time when we confiscated 71%. To Washington. And it was only for the purpose of the origin of the ivory, but not for good purposes.
Okay. Was that to, that was probably to Wasser, Sam Wasser at University of Washington, maybe?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so yeah, so that all, he's a couple slides here left, but so we have a problem. So for us, we have to determine, we have to verify to the court every. And the only way to do it is DNA. Because we make mastodon and mammoth legal. So we have to distinguish between those, and we have to do the DNA testing. So our problem is our Attorney General's office for Washington State will only accept an accredited laboratory that follows certain protocols, has a good clean history as far as testing procedures, that type of stuff. And the only problem with that is, I have two options. I can hopefully find a federal nexus to my case, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Laboratory will take it for me and test it, and that's free. Well, with my last case, I submitted DNA, or I submitted 2 samples for DNA 8 months ago, and I still have no result. So 8 months, I still can't prosecute that. My case is done. It's been done for 7 months, but I still have no results. So I sit and wait for probably 8 months to a year. My other option is to use an accredited laboratory in California, but they charge me $1,000 every time I submit 1 sample. So you can imagine my bosses are not overly happy about that. And I test none of those samples down there for $1,000 a piece. So big problem when you're required to actually use a forensically accredited lab. Though there are quite a few non-forensically accredited labs. And so we talked about Dr. Wasser's at the University of Washington. And I think that's actually, yeah, the next slide. But so these are places like your universities. And these are places like the state of Washington has its own its own genetic laboratory. Well, they're not accredited, but that's all they do is do DNA for fish and wildlife. But that's still not, per our Attorney General's office, that's still not good enough. But our local prosecutors are okay with that. So that's where we're kind of leaning. We're trying to stay away from charging people in state court, doing it a little bit differently. And you can see using some of those things. If you look at the very bottom, so instead of me waiting 8 months to a year, at the University of Washington, I just took a sample in, and it's 2 weeks, and it's $65. So a dramatic difference between the two. And there it is. I mean, that's where I'm kind of, my bosses haven't heard all this kind of stuff. But that's really where I think we should be going as an agency, is going to the University of Washington. They may not be accredited, but they're cheap, they're fast, and these guys know what they're doing. So Dr. Wasser, I mean, it says on here, so he literally... And their science is so good that, like, all I care about is determining whether or not it's, the elephant species. They actually have it down pretty well down to a science where they can determine which specific population it came from, whether it was forest or wherever it came from. And that's what a lot of agencies are doing, is sending him samples. So he does a lot of work with Vietnam, Cambodia, that type of stuff. A lot of law enforcement work for Interpol, FBI, New York PD. So it's not like he doesn't know what he's doing, but he's just not forensically accredited by the agencies that govern that. So one other thing that we've tried, super slick technology. Again, we're strapped for resources. We don't have many officers dedicated to it. We don't have access as a state agency to a lot of federal databases like customs and that type of stuff. So we had an NGO kind of got together, and they actually built the software for us that would do all the work for us. And so whatever cues you put in, so if I put in, just one of my suspects, and anything that I said triggered it, maybe shipments over 10,000 pounds, shipments that came from a area, a priority area, from here to here. I could put in all those criteria, and that program would send me a text message, hey, go to the airport today because there's probably a shipment that's going to have some illegal stuff in it. Super, super great technology. The problem was they were an NGO. They hid a bunch of costs from us. Didn't tell us it was going to cost us 5 years down the road. They kind of set it up so we'd be bought into it. And the other thing was they assumed that they were going to have access to a federal law enforcement database. So that program got shut down really quickly. But there are lots of people out there that can write these programs. So probably the easiest thing for us is our straight up partnerships with organizations like this. Kind of leveraging those person-to-person relationships, so we have someone to call. We'll sit down with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they have one with Customs and Border Patrol, the Food and Drug Administration, Homeland Security guys, all that kind of stuff. And though I can't get there as a state guy speaking to a federal agent, because I know this person, now that I met him at a meeting or I see him every month, a lot of times they'll do a bunch of work for me, or they'll unofficially give me. So that's really where we try to. That's really where we are the most productive when it comes to our investigations. There are also, so Dr. Wasser's lab, if you guys ever have a chance to use his lab, at least check it out online, because he's got all of his stuff posted. But I think he's in Uganda right now, but he's back and forth between, all over this continent, just routinely, several times a year. And he's back doing a bunch of DNA work for the elephant populations. So he kind of got a crazy idea up at the University of Washington. He is actually forming what he's termed the Center for Forensic Excellence. So he's bringing in specialists from all over the world to sit on this panel to say, hey, who's our best point of contact for exotic woods? Who is it for elephant? Who is it for whatever? So he's going to try to get it set up where he's a recognized laboratory that's supported by all these federal agencies, all these international agencies, so he can do a lot of this work for cheap, for fast. So that's kind of what we're hoping. Probably in the next year or two, I'm hoping this thing gets up and running. But that's kind of what I'm pushing all of my ivory work to him, so he can kind of build his, he can kind of build that organization out. And probably the last thing, anyone have any familiarity or use Intel-based software for analysis? Yeah, I2 Analyst Notebook, Sentinel Visualizer, yes? Some. What do you guys use?
We used it in France. But we are not quite familiar. We are not experienced enough.
Yeah. It is super nice, and it's the same thing. I do that for us. We use Sentinel Visualizer, but I don't know. The software is way too smart, and so I don't know how to use it fully. But it is really, really slick software, because we do a lot of business records and a lot of cell phone records, and so when you capture that on your computer and you just drag the folder to it, it tells you who the most important person is in that guy's cell phone, based on every call he's ever made or every text he's ever sent. And it actually just links all those. So all you have to do is, when you do your cell phone warrants, just drag that information, drag and drop it into a folder, and the Analyst Notebook or the Sentinel Visualizer just does it all for you and ties all these people together visually so you can see it, and then tells you who the people he talks to the most. So it paints a pretty good picture as to who your bad folks are. So I think that's it from Washington's side of the house. Is there any questions on Washington's side? Yes, sir.
Yeah. One state running the trade and the other one is not. That must be easy enough. getting the federal grants for the importation of these smaller products in USA.
Absolutely, and that's our big concern as well. We're trying to get everyone on board, and so I have a recent case where, I mean, it's just one guy, and this goes back to that. So over the course of 50 years, he inherited or went out and bought pieces of ivory. And so, I mean, the short of it was, he was advertising on eBay or something. And so we bought from him. And we went in and told him, hey, this is illegal. He said, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway, and here's how I do it. So he told us all the bad stuff how he did it. So we got into his house, and I think we collected over 2,000 pieces of elephant, and then he had thousands of pieces of other stuff. So I'm looking, and I realize I go back and I pull all the eBay records. And you realize he's into 13, 14 different states, and he's into 4 or 5 different countries. Half of the states didn't have any laws, like at all, banning it. So they totally allow sale of adult. eBay doesn't stop it. The states don't care. And at least that's how I interpret it. And even a few of those states have laws in place. And when I called a detective or someone, they weren't aware. I did educate them on their own laws because they just never looked. And so, yeah, it's a massive, massive concern because, like in Washington State, he can just drive east, go over a border into the state of Idaho, and he can sell it. It's legal all day long. So it's a massive, massive problem for us.
And again, from your presentation, I think Malawi, we are lacking technology. I'm sure that we may have information, but we don't have like the devices to detect probably the alcohol and all those stuff. So I think we need those devices. We need to advance ourselves in terms of technology, so that we can be able to detect more.
Yeah, and that's something I can do. Because I know that's part of the project. I mean, my boss gave it to me and said, hey, you have to figure out all the technology piece and lay it all out there for us so we can make a decision. Because we do, for the first time, we have an outside agency that's willing to give us money for technology. And we're just trying to figure out what the best technology is. And so, yeah, I'll be happy to coordinate the facilitators here, and I can give them whatever information I have, and they can push it out to you guys. I mean, I'll let you know what I. But there are some really good potentials, and if you can get folks like World Wildlife Fund and all that kind of stuff, I mean, this is huge for me because just the fact that I get to see everyone in person and email list. Yeah, if I forget, you guys call me, reach out to me. I'll give you that list of what I know about the forensic stuff on the electronic side, the tech side. Yes, sir.
Only the same regulations. From you, you see that is so that each state have the similar regulations that they can control the wildlife programs from exploitation. I know it's the same in some countries. We say some countries are saying no. So if we don't harmonize the regulations and policies, it means we also have programs.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would love nothing more than that. And I know that's what we're trying to do with at least. Prior to the last couple of years, I mean, it's been really tough working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and just because we don't have a lot of interest in on. But now that we have this the ivory piece, and the ivory and rhino piece, really it kind of opens up a lot of doors with us. So they're the ones with the juice. They're the ones that can change all that stuff at their level. We can change just the state, but that's really all we can do. We can push it out, and we can change that at the state level, which I think we're doing. we're trying to advertise it, show everyone else, hey, look at this, it's working really well for us. Because we get into, I go buy a piece of ivory from someone, and I get into their house and they have a couple of grams of meth, and it's a drug dealer. So it's a great thing because we're getting a bunch of drugs off the street, when really it was all just about a piece of ivory to start. But I can only change, I think we can only really affect the state, and I think by working with the feds, we're going to try to get them to change that as well, to get more buy-in at the state level. But yeah, it would be huge for us if we do that. Yes, sir.
If the event is only you have sent the results, the DNA, the samples of the DNA analysis, when the results have come, who is supposed to present the results? Is it the investigator or the one who will be?
Okay, so yeah, so that's a good question. It was in my notes, I totally skipped over it. So that's one of the things that comes with when I say like forensically accredited, in parentheses there. So that is, really that comes with a subject matter expert that's willing to testify in court to the findings, how they arrived at those, they maintain chain of custody, all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, none. A lot of those for to go with the forensically accredited ones. So, yes.
Possibly.
That information might supposed to be in custody. Or these days, if the DNA will take longer without coming back to the results, should we be still continue keeping that person in custody whilst waiting for the?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because we have the same problem. And so, for instance, I'm just talking about methamphetamines. So just the other day, someone offered to sell me a piece of an elephant. I was carved a piece of elephant. And he has lied to me. He doesn't have it anymore. He already traded it, sold it away. But when I go there, I know I've seen it. He's talked about it. So I write a search warrant. I get into his house, and then we find a bunch of meth. And so at that point, he and I sit down, and obviously all the officers there, and we sit down and we say, hey, so for your confession, we'll do you the favor and not arrest you tonight. But we need to know where the tusk is. So he tells us where the tusk is. So we go and write a warrant for some other place. But we don't arrest him. We could, but not on the elephant. We could get him on the drugs. I could have arrested him on the drugs. But the tusk itself, because we don't have definitive proof, there's no way that would stand up in court. Like they'd throw it out immediately. And that would ruin it for the rest of my investigations. So yeah, we wouldn't. How we do it anymore is almost everything goes through our prosecutors. So we write up the case, we give it to the prosecutor, we forget it, and they decide whether or not they want to go through it, file charges. But we almost arrest no one anymore. We wait until the prosecutors take a look at it, the whole case, and make a decision.
In terms of involvement, if we can. Now, sometimes most of the people have been found in possession of, those suspicions, either at the airport or somewhere else. But failing to get the source, just because of the sources that we have. How are we going to tackle on those issues so that we can reach those people who are taking this species from the field and passing over to the buyers and then proceeding to something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've tried. We try to do, I should say we're still trying to do, basically a natural resources one, where it's just natural resources. You figure out what's going on, so you tie it in that way. But we have not had not very many people putting information in. Almost all of our stuff has been, you suspect someone, you call me, or I suspect someone, I call somebody. But yeah, we don't have anything that makes those connections. And that's definitely a need. And I think we've tried it, but just we try to reach out to all the natural resources, law enforcement agencies in the states, and there's not much participation. Anyone else? Ian? Right? Oh, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to know from your side about questions. You are not able to arrest somebody who has been found in possession of
What could
the source of information or intelligence.
Yeah, so yes, so then it's a good question because really, like I said, I can't establish. It's an elephant piece. And so I guess, let me see if I'm understanding your question correctly. So if you have a piece of ivory and I come to you and I find it, maybe it's ivory, maybe it's not, or maybe it's elephant ivory, maybe it's not. I'm going to tell you, I hope you're okay with it, because if I take it, I have the statutory authority to take it from you. If I find out, then yes, you're in trouble. More often than not, people will talk to us because it goes much better for them if they just tell us it's ivory. But yeah,
yes, at the second point, there are other people in the villages who have got information concerning ivory courts. Of course, it's a vivid information, but where can we ask about that money with the informant needs, or else who is responsible for that cash? So now, what if maybe sometimes it would not be good for we investigators to be having a certain amount of cash, I don't know from where, either from you or either from the nation bank, to be giving, so that those informants, once they give us information, in turn, we give the amount which they ask. In so doing, I think we may prosper.
so, yes. Yeah, I know what I want to say. I'm trying to. So I know, like for me, so we use confidential informants all the time, right? I mean, that's it. We're basically trained and told don't use confidential informants because I'll tell you almost to a T. I can only think of one in my history in law enforcement. So if I use a confidential informant, I might as well start investigating a case against them because they are doing something wrong. So we do pay people for money, or pay people monies or goods or something like that. Something you see that they can use. But we have to monitor it very closely. So my boss will give me $500 for you to tell me. So I've made the assessment. I've been interviewed you a number of times. You have much credible information. You're in the business, and I know you're not just a one-time guy. You buy a ton of iron. You poach a ton of animals. You do this. That makes you of interest to me. So I'll pay you. I'll happily write. I'm going to write it down. $500 witnessed by this person. And you have a contract. This is and you are my informant and give me all your address. And so that's how we do it almost every single time. Is you've got witnesses, you give me the money, you've got a written record, and yeah, so yeah, we do that quite often.
I just want to make a contribution of that. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm coming from the World Health Care This unit is under the Department of Public Affairs, and it is open to everyone. In as far as the issue of sharing information, whether it is in the North region, Southern region, or Central region, whenever there is an information, let us communicate. And when it comes to informers, we need to scrutinize our informers, whether they are qualifying to be informers. Because there are some informers that can just demand money. Their money is for informers. When you can say that you are for an informant which you need to be managed in terms of organized crime, let us communicate, we manage the informant, he gives us information, we make arrests and seizures, and at the end of the day, there is money for incentives. Whenever an informant has given an information, we have success, we give the money. And there is standard payment of the informants. We have that sure. Thank you.
Just to add on what my colleague has said, if he is having an informant, let him call my colleague from the facts and knowledge of police. They can be handled it. Those monies are there. They'll be given, provided the information is fruitful. Yeah.
Yeah, Alice, good way to do business. Can I get you the back?
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize what you said. Before I spoke, I was going to say the same thing, that there is a lack of information sharing, which I think is coming out now to say some of the questions that we are asking, the information is already available there within the system. But what is needed now is to find a way of how that information can be shared to everyone else within the system, so that everyone is aware of what they're supposed to do, where the opportunities are available, and even how to approach informants. Sharing very easily, so that we don't have similar problems of the occurring, say for example in Karonga, and yet there's a solution in Zuzu or in Chitiba to a problem that we're encountering in Karonga. So let's create that system which can make the flow of information very easy for us to be able to deal with the issues that we're supposed to do.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right, thank you.